Peter Lawson visited Eleanor every Sunday, not because anyone expected him to, not because routine fixed grief. It didn't. But after 43 years of marriage, Sunday still somehow felt like theirs. So every Sunday at 10 o'clock, rain or shine, Peter parked beside the cemetery gates, walked the familiar gravel path, stopped at the florist on the corner if the garden looked particularly disappointing, and brought flowers. Nothing extravagant. Eleanor would have hated extravagant. "Save your money," she used to say. "Flowers are lovely, but heating bills are essential." Very Eleanor logic. The cemetery sat quietly at the edge of town. Old trees, weathered stone, the sort of peaceful place most people never noticed unless life had given them reason to. Peter never stayed long. 15 minutes usually. 20 if he had something worth complaining about. He talked sometimes. Not dramatically. Just ordinary things. The neighbor's cat causing trouble. The weather. Whether supermarkets deliberately moved things to confuse pensioners. The sort of conversations married people had after years together. Only now, one side stayed painfully quiet. That particular Sunday marked 3 months since Eleanor died. Peter disliked anniversaries. Too much fuss. Too much expectation that grief ought to behave properly, as though sadness followed calendars. Still, he had bought better flowers than usual. White roses. Eleanor liked white roses, though she'd probably have said they were overpriced. As he approached the grave, Peter slowed, because there were already flowers there. Fresh ones. Bright spring tulips. Carefully arranged. More than usual. Odd. Peter frowned slightly. Looked around. Nobody nearby. Just quiet. Birdsong somewhere in the trees. He placed his own flowers beside them. Stood for a moment, then noticed something tucked carefully beneath the tulips. A folded piece of paper. Plain. Simple. Only 2 words written across the front. For Eleanor. Peter hesitated, then picked it up, opened it carefully. Inside, only 1 line. "Thank you for staying." That was all. No name, no explanation, no clue what exactly Eleanor had stayed for. Peter turned the paper over. Blank. Looked around again. Still nobody. Still quiet. Strange. He slipped the note into his coat pocket. Stood there another minute. Then looked down at Eleanor's grave. "What exactly is this about, El?" The silence remained, as always, deeply unhelpful. Still, on the drive home, he found himself thinking about it once, only briefly. Because, realistically, what exactly were you supposed to do with a mysterious note left at a grave? Life continued. Tea needed making. Shopping needed doing. The boiler started making suspicious noises. Ordinary life. Yet, the following Sunday, without really meaning to, Peter noticed himself looking ahead before he reached Eleanor's grave. Just in case. And there they were again. Fresh flowers. White lilies this time. And another folded note. Peter stood still for a moment. White lilies, fresh, carefully placed, deliberate, not accidental. And beside them, another folded note. Same plain paper, same careful handwriting across the front. For Eleanor. Peter crouched slowly, picked it up, opened it. Only 1 sentence. "You made the hard days easier. Thank you." That was all. No name, no explanation. Just that. Peter read it twice, then frowned, because somehow this one felt different. Personal. The sort of thing people only said when something had mattered. He slipped the note into his pocket beside the first, looked at Eleanor's grave, then quietly muttered, "What were you up to, Eleanor. Again, the silence remained deeply unhelpful. Still, something had shifted now. Not suspicion exactly, curiosity. Because after 43 years, you assumed you knew the shape of someone's life. Not every tiny detail. Of course not. But the important things. Didn't you? The rest of the week passed mostly as normal. Mostly. Peter thought about the notes perhaps more than he intended. Not obsessively, just now and then. Standing in the kitchen, making tea, wondering, who leaves flowers for someone else's wife? And what exactly had Eleanor done? The frustrating thing about grief, Peter had learned, was how badly memory behaved. Big moments stayed. Small things disappeared. He could remember, perfectly, the ridiculous argument they once had over buying an unnecessarily expensive toaster. Yet entire, ordinary afternoons? Gone. The following Sunday, Peter arrived earlier, not intentionally. Obviously, the cemetery sat quiet beneath pale spring sunlight. Cold enough for coats. Still enough to hear birds high in the trees. And before he even reached the grave, he saw them. Fresh flowers again. Small, pale carnations this time. And another folded note tucked carefully beneath them. Peter let out a quiet breath, half sigh, half disbelief. Well, he muttered, you've become popular. He crouched slowly, picked up the note, opened it. Only one sentence. You were kind when life was frightening. Peter stood still, read it again, then frowned harder, because suddenly, for reasons he couldn't explain, a memory stirred. Faint. Hospitals. Eleanor mentioning someone being poorly. Odd afternoons. Occasional complaints about awful vending machine tea. Things he had never really questioned. Not because he didn't care. Just because after 43 years, ordinary details blurred together. You stopped asking for the whole story. You assumed there would always be time. Peter sat on the nearby bench. Something he almost never did. The folded notes resting quietly in his pocket. Flowers beside Eleanor's grave. Cold sunlight through the trees. And somehow, for the first time in months, Sunday no longer felt entirely predictable. He looked down at the grave, shook his head slightly. What were you up to, Eleanor? And somehow, for the first time, the question didn't feel rhetorical. The following Sunday, Peter arrived earlier again, this time entirely on purpose, which he chose not to think about too much. The morning cool and bright, spring finally beginning to make an effort. He carried yellow tulips. Eleanor liked yellow, said cheerful flowers improved people's moods. Peter had never found strong evidence of this. Still, he bought them anyway. As he walked the familiar path, he slowed, because someone was already standing beside Eleanor's grave. A woman, mid-40s perhaps, dark coat, holding flowers, not crying, not dramatic, just standing quietly, like somebody visiting somewhere that mattered. Peter hesitated, suddenly unsure what the social rules were for. Excuse me? Why are you leaving mysterious notes on my wife's grave? Still, walking away felt ridiculous, so instead, awkwardly, he cleared his throat. The woman turned, looked startled for a second. Then, to Peter's confusion, her expression softened immediately. Oh, she said quietly. You must be Peter. Peter blinked. Yes. The woman smiled faintly. Eleanor talked about you. And somehow, unexpectedly, that landed harder than it should have. Because suddenly, for the first time in a very long while, Eleanor felt oddly close again. Not memory close. Present close. Like part of her still quietly existed somewhere outside photographs. The woman looked down at the flowers in her hands, then back at him. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I hope this hasn't upset you." Peter hesitated, because honestly, he wasn't entirely sure what he felt. Confused, curious, slightly unsettled. Mostly confused, he admitted. That earned the smallest laugh. "Fair." The woman nodded toward the grave. "My dad was at St. Anne's Hospice." Peter frowned slightly. Recognition. Faint, but there. "She used to come in sometimes," the woman said. "Just to sit with people." Peter said nothing, because somehow he still hadn't quite caught up. "There were days I couldn't stay," she said quietly. "Work. Life." She glanced down at the flowers. "And your Eleanor." A small smile. She never liked people being left on their own. Peter looked at the grave, at the flowers, at the folded notes in his coat pocket, and somehow that sounded exactly like Eleanor. Practical, quiet, the sort of kindness that never announced itself. The woman hesitated, then reached into her handbag. "I nearly didn't bring this," she said, "but Dad kept it." She handed Peter a photograph. Old, slightly bent at the corners. Peter looked down and stopped, because there, beside a hospice bed, sat Eleanor, crossword book in hand, smiling at a man Peter had never met, looking entirely like she belonged there, and somehow, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that hit him harder than the flowers had. Peter took the photograph home, though for several minutes he simply sat in the car holding it, looking at Eleanor, really looking, because somehow it felt strange seeing her somewhere he had never been, like discovering a room in a house you thought you already knew. At home. He placed the photograph on the kitchen table, made tea, then sat down and looked at it again. There she was, crossword book balanced on her lap, looking completely at ease, completely herself. And suddenly, small memories shifted shape. Odd afternoons, Eleanor saying, "Back later," or "Someone needed company." Things he had never really questioned, not because he didn't care, just because after 43 years, ordinary details stopped feeling important, until suddenly they were. The following Sunday, Peter arrived with flowers as usual, though now, without really meaning to, he found himself wondering whose note might be waiting, which felt odd, because cemeteries were not generally places you arrived feeling curious. Yet here he was, the morning cold enough to turn breath visible, thin sunlight slipping between the trees, and already fresh flowers rested beside Eleanor's grave, small, pale roses, another folded note tucked carefully beneath them. Peter opened it slowly. "Thank you for staying. That was all. No name, no explanation. But this time, for the first time, Peter thought he understood. Not completely, but enough. Enough to picture Eleanor sitting beside hospital beds, quiet rooms, long afternoons, just staying. Because apparently, that was the sort of thing Eleanor had done, quietly, without fuss. Peter folded the note carefully, slipped it into his coat pocket, then noticed someone nearby, an older man standing a few rows away, holding flowers, waiting, not quite visiting, not quite leaving either. The man hesitated, then slowly approached. "You're Peter?" Peter blinked. Apparently, this was becoming a thing. "Yes." The man nodded once, looked oddly nervous. "My wife knew Eleanor." Peter waited. The man looked down at the flowers in his hands. "My wife had dialysis." A pause. Every Tuesday. Peter nodded slightly. The man smiled faintly. She hated going. Then, until Eleanor started turning up. Peter frowned slightly. Turning up? The man nodded. Tea, in a flask, sometimes. A small smile. Puzzle books. Then quietly. Mostly she just sat with her. He looked toward Eleanor's grave. Said nobody should go through miserable things on their own. Peter looked down at the flowers, the folded note warm in his pocket, and suddenly, unexpectedly, he felt proud, because somehow, the woman he had loved for 43 years was still quietly making people feel less alone. The Sundays continued. Not every week, but often enough. Flowers, short notes, different handwriting, different people, and slowly, without quite meaning to, Peter began recognizing little pieces of Eleanor he had somehow missed. One woman remembered Eleanor bringing magazines to the hospice because nobody should have to stare at beige walls all afternoon. An older man laughed quietly and said, "Your wife had very strong opinions about weak tea." Apparently, Eleanor had quietly organized comfort wherever she went. Tea, crosswords, company, the ordinary things that mattered more than people admitted, and more than once. Peter heard some version of the same sentence. She hated people being left on their own. That sentence stayed with him, not dramatically, just quietly, because suddenly, small memories shifted shape, unexpected errands, cold cups of tea left half-finished at home, Eleanor arriving back late saying, "Sorry, love, someone needed me." Things he had never really thought about, not because he didn't care, just because after 43 years, you stopped asking for every detail. You thought there would always be time. Then one Sunday, there were no flowers, no note, nothing, just spring sunlight and quiet. Peter stood there for a second, oddly disappointed, then frowned at himself, because apparently this had become something, routine perhaps, company, a strange sort of comfort. He placed Eleanor's flowers carefully, stood quietly for a moment, then noticed a grave a few rows over, small, weathered, no flowers, no signs anyone had visited in a long time. Peter looked at it, then at Eleanor, then sighed quietly, because unfortunately, he already knew exactly what she would say. Peter stood there for a moment, hands tucked into his coat pockets, looking between the neglected grave and Eleanor, because somehow, after all these Sundays, he could already hear what she would say, clear as anything, practical, certain, not dramatic, just Eleanor. Well, somebody ought to. That had been her way with most things. Leaky taps, lonely neighbors, people sitting through difficult afternoons alone. Peter let out a quiet breath, shook his head slightly. "All right," he muttered. "You win." The following Sunday, he brought 2 bunches of flowers. Nothing extravagant. Eleanor would have complained about extravagant. 1 bunch for her. 1 for the small grave nearby. The name half faded. The stone weathered soft with time. Peter placed the flowers carefully, stood awkwardly for a second, because apparently he had become the sort of man who talked in cemeteries. "Your fault," he said quietly toward Eleanor, "just so we're clear." Then, as he turned, something caught his eye. A folded note tucked beneath Eleanor's flowers. New. He picked it up, opened it carefully. Only 1 sentence. "Thank you for sharing her with us." Peter stood very still, read it again, then looked down at Eleanor's grave, at the flowers, at the little stack of folded notes he now kept safely in the kitchen drawer, and suddenly something settled. Not grief. That stayed. Love stayed too. Missing someone stayed. But something around the edges softened, because somehow, without ever meaning to, Eleanor had left him one final thing. Proof. Quiet, ordinary proof that a life did not need to be loud to matter. Peter stood there a while longer, then glanced toward the neglected grave nearby, the fresh flowers resting there, and despite himself, smiled. Because annoyingly, after all this time, Eleanor was still quietly telling him what to do. The silence remained, as always, deeply unhelpful, though somehow it no longer felt quite so lonely